Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday Serial. So, I wanted to talk about a brief moment that happened between the Mars run that I talked about in the previous Green Lantern video, and before I get to the longer chunk of the next real run with Winnick, and then at Mars again. I'm not sure how I'm going to treat that because Mars does like a few issues at the end. I want to read it before knowing if I have much to say about it, obviously. I want to talk about this moment that happened in between, where there were three issues of Green Lantern 26, 27, 28 by Ferber, and then this weirdo event, Green Lantern Circle of Fire, that both took place in around the same time. This event took place over basically a month, with a new issue being released basically every week for 6 weeks, so a month and a half. And I think it doubled up on these bookends where it was Circle of Fire 1 and 2, and then in between it was Green Lantern Firestorm, Green Lantern, Green Lantern, Green Lantern Strange, Green Lantern Power Girl, and Green Lantern Atom. So I'm just going to dive into the Circle of Fire first because we're pretty much there. So the initial Circle of Fire sets up our problem. There's this nightmare bad guy who's all-encompassing and evil, cosmic level threat, and wipes out better part of the Justice League. Toot sweet. And so Kyle Rayner's the remaining leaguer who's tasked to basically put together a little strike squad and figure out how to accomplish this villain. But the twist, though, and kind of the link to the end that we get, is that this is a character Kyle created for some crude comic book when he was a kid growing up, and this was the bad guy in it. So he knows something up, he knows something's up, and it involves him. Yeah, so I don't know. It's an interesting little setup. Nothing too crazy, but fun. Should also note that this was written by Vaughn again. It had a pile of artists on it. And then the talent across these books is almost worth noting as we go. So with each established DC character, League connected, is some Green Lantern. And to spoil the ending, but what makes these more interesting to read knowing is that each one of these Green Lanterns is actually a construct from Kyle, that's an aspect of his personality in some way. And until you have that bit of knowledge, these are actually a much more empty comics, and knowing that actually makes them worth the while, I think, because none of them are particularly strong except for one issue. So the Firestorm one deals primarily with the fact that Firestorm is just the jock with the superpowers now. He doesn't have this doctor in his head, and he's kind of learning to be a hero, kind of the way Kyle has been in some ways. And this Green Lantern is like a robot, I guess, to like reflect a scientific idea. I don't know. Kind of comes together, but... And that one was done by Ferber. Then we get Winnick, who's going to be taking over the book, doing the best issue of all these in-betweens, which is Green Lantern, Green Lantern. Now, this is Kyle meeting with what turns out not to be, but presents itself as Alex, his girlfriend that was stuffed in the refrigerator, as the Green Lantern of her alternate reality. But in her reality, he was killed. They purposely never go into the details, and they kind of fall in love with each other again, and it's a bit overly romantic, but the knowledge of the fact that it's his interpretation of that happening to her, because in his mind at the time she was more deserving of the ring than him, is actually really interesting. Actually does a lot about the character to actually see that play out. This is where we have our sci-fi fantasy elements, whatever, come through to actually make a compelling character story amidst something that's very plot heavy, which I thought was interesting. Next is this weirdo Green Lantern that's like generations removed, so it's one of West's descendants who gets the ring, like Wally West, so it's a Flash Green Lantern, and she has some weird rules about what she can do with her power set that's like alluded to but never actually explained, and Adam Strange is dealing with her, and this is just a bunch of weird sci-fi stuff. And this one's done by Vaughn. I think he wanted to play with some Adam Strange stuff ideas. I don't know, it's interesting, but it's not a ton. The next is Power Girl with Green Lantern. This is the early days of Birds of Prey with this knight-esque Green Lantern, so like a very stereotypical but misogynistic superhero. So it's actually interesting to see Power Girl play off that. And I think it's an interesting Power Girl moment more than anything. This issue's kind of fun, but no big shakes. This one's done by Scott Beatty, who honestly I don't know. And then we get Vaughn again doing Green Lantern and the Atom. And this Green Lantern is actually two Green Lanterns that are twins, sharing powers, and the Atom's dealing with them. This one actually sets up some plot contrivances and whatnot for our final act, so nothing major. Like, you could skip it, but I think of them, this actually tries to move the needle a bit more as far as the story, so it's a little more investing in that way, but nothing major. Just a few ideas of how this alien kind of relates to the universe, and they start to get some weird ideas of it existing outside of Kyle, which end up not being true but making sense. So it all wraps up here into where all these aspects of Kyle come back in, and we kind of get a weird if you remember, there's that Marvel book The Sentry where the darkness was like his alter ego but like was him at the same time, so it was this weird play with the duality of man kind of deal. And so Kyle has a bit of that. There's a promise of power at one point for letting the evil live on. And Kyle rejects it. And at the end of this, the big moment is in the final pages, where Kyle says basically like, I let you all down. All this terrible stuff happened effectively only because of me. And so he's basically willing to offer and tender his resignation and offer his ring to the League, which is weird, because they don't actually really have any say over the ring. But at the same time, and this is a problem set up by Mars's run, is Ganthet should, but he's been nowhere. Like, he popped in the middle of the Mars run and left with Hal, so I assume something happened somewhere with that, but it wasn't in the pages of Green Lantern, where why would it be? It's only the most Green Lantern related stuff within the DC universe, so why would it take place in that book? So Kyle's basically offering to say like, all this happened because of me. And it's interesting because we have Batman, who's been on Kyle's case before, but I think has taken something to shine to him because he's showing that he's growing up and becoming a hero, maybe somewhat akin to one of the Robins, and says, as far as I'm concerned, you finally deserve to be here, which is this weird way of saying like growing up is facing your darker impulses or desires or mistakes and doing something about them and choosing the right thing. And Superman says a bit about like, now the real fight begins, because now you're going to have to essentially fight this threat every day and take it on. So every day is kind of a challenge, which is something. I think the problem is like the core, the real message of this book is like in 2 pages at the end, and it's some really interesting stuff, but we don't really get to explore it, and so that's a little frustrating. But it was interesting, and the bigger thing here to the Kyle's character is that he, after everything in the Mars run, with this little bit, which by and large just should have been in the book, like we could have burned some issues to put more or less this in there, though you could compact this event to less pages. There's faff in here that could go. Something happens with Kyle here where I feel like we're on to the next step. Now, while this was running, I'd say a short run, though Berber has like an issue or two later as a fill-in. There's like this little 3-issue jaunt I'm willing to say this is the equivalent of a run, because what Ferber does in 3 issues here is the equivalent of what we get out of some runs with characters nowadays. Because what we get is 3 separate stories. When you deal with runs anymore, some of them don't even get 3 separate stories, because that would be a year and a half of comics anymore if they're doled out, 6 issues a pop. So the first is this Caged, where Kyle puts on some facade of being a criminal, and going into this meta jail where they're trying to figure out what's going on with the inmates. They find out the warden's been abusing the prisoners. But what's really cool about this jail is from the Mars run. We're returning to it, and we're exploring this idea of Kyle being a superhero and offering up and pushing on the warden because he knows something's up, and he's being an actual hero and going in and doing some good, even for the criminals that he puts away. This issue puts Kyle at a level of superhero that very few superheroes seem to get to. This was also addressed in Circle Fire, and I forgot this one little moment where Superman says, what you did with fighting and rejecting your inner demons is surpass what your predecessor never did, a la the Parallax thing. So between those two, we have this bit where Kyle is now a superhero that is going out doing good, actively seeking to do good, finding ways to do things. We've also seen some moments, which is actually brought up in this issue, 27, which is interesting because this is actually not from the point of view of Killer Frost, but it's from the point of view of Effigy, that one villain that I liked at the end of the other run, where we see the villains, and we actually see the villain get away in this issue. But what's interesting is we see Kyle has read up on villains, so if they're DC known, he still knows a thing or two about them because he's done the homework, he's done the research, he's trying, he's constantly improving, and he's constantly doing a lot. And now we kind of see that scrappy upstart actually transform into a competent player, which I think is really interesting because that whole method and mode of superheroes trying to be role models is great. And here we see someone who really started out and was really harangued for not knowing his stuff, making mistakes, doing all that. But even though he does kind of screw up and make other mistakes here and there, he's constantly growing and improving, which is putting him above the other peers that he'd otherwise be compared to. And then we get Green Lantern 128, which frankly is maybe weaker than the other 2 issues, but is still interesting. It's a good thing to do with a character like Green Lantern from time to time, where we have this little tete-a-tete between him and Arsenal, who have dated similar characters and whatnot, but know each other. They're a little frenemy, kind of, with each other. But it's great to have this dynamic between them because it's nice to see Kyle kind of work with characters that aren't demeaning to him for like being Justice League established, like Martian Manhunter treating him like a child, or Batman treating him like a child, or Superman treating him like a child, or Flash more or less treating him like a child. But here we get Arsenal, who came up in the Teen Titans, was with him, but Kyle actually got to the Justice League before he did. But Arsenal was taking over and actually leading the Titans, so they both kind of rose in the ranks in their own way. And it feels more equal footing. And what's cool in here is we have a moment where Kyle basically can't rely on the ring and needs to help with this hostage situation that Arsenal's a part of, and makes a shot that's the kind that Arsenal would normally brag about. And it's a good kind of moment because even getting there and getting to that shot, in doing so, Kyle doesn't have the ring. He just has to be a guy in a suit, using what he can. And part of that use is threatening, like, he can use his ring in the moment because there's no way for the bad guys to know, which is clever and somewhat good writing for like these kind of quick moments, these issues that take place and are done over quickly, works well to service the action as opposed to breaking it up over issue. And so that's great. I don't think it adds as much as the other two, but it's still a good issue. And if you're looking to just read a little bit of Green Lantern and get kind of a feel for Kyle before the big shakeup that happens with Johns, I actually really recommend those 3 issues in particular. Again, they're 126, 127, and 128. These are some of the better issues. They're nothing that anyone's going to be bragging about, but they're a good kind of like cross-section of the character, and I think speaks to why people like Kyle so much. I gotta say, these reignited my excitement for Kyle as a character after kind of waning, and now I'm more excited to get to the next run, though I'm a little put off about reading a Space Cop given some current events. Don't need to dig into that right now. But I thought you guys would maybe appreciate a little quicker video that actually dug deeper into various issues. So yeah, cheers, talk to you later, bye.